My son's teacher has been giving him strange homework. His latest homework was deadly. When my son got to a new class teacher, Mrs. Antonia, I always saw something was off about her, but I didn't complain since she seemed to give the children simple homework tasks that could easily be completed at night. One night, the teacher asked them to find out what their parent did at work and asked three questions about their jobs. And another night, he had to research his favorite animal and find out three interesting things about them. Every night, I would ask my son Timothy if he has homework that I could help him with. And that was when I noticed his homework was becoming a little bit strange. One night, in Timothy's third week of being new in his class, he came home looking very upset. I asked him when I noticed it what was wrong, and he told me that everything was okay. I then asked him about his homework for the night, and he told me that he didn't have any homework for that night. This was surprising because he always has homework every single night since he's been in Mrs. Antonia's class. So it's strange that he doesn't have any suddenly. Timothy then left where I was and went into his room, shutting the door behind himself. He didn't usually close the door, but I felt that he wanted some privacy. Although I could tell that something was wrong, he didn't want to tell me. Timothy spent most of his time in his room apart from dinner time, when me and my wife told him that he had to sit at the dinner table with us. He seemed to be in a happy mood during dinner as he was talking and making jokes like he normally does. After dinner, he went back to his room and closed the door. We decided to let him stay there for a while, and after like an hour or two, I went in to see him to tell him that it was time to go to bed. I walked down to his room and opened the door, and when I looked in it, I saw that he had already fallen asleep over his workload. I quietly walked up to him to gently wake him up so I could move him to his bed, and that was when I saw it. The homework task that was set for Timothy that night. The title was written on it, "Would I miss my parents if I no longer live with them?" At first, I was surprised. This is a very rare task for a 9 years old child. I didn't know how to react to this. I continued to read through to see what else he had written. He had written, "I will miss both my mom and my dad very much. I love them both a lot and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them, but I'll probably love someone else the same way I love them. If I had to, like you were saying today in class, Mrs. Antonia." When I read the final sentence, I felt a chill run down my spine. I'll probably love someone else the same way I love them if I had to. That was struck me like a brick to the face. What has Mrs. Antonia been telling my son? What was the purpose of telling him all these things? I foolishly decided not to tell my wife about what I have found out. She would worry, and she probably has the right to worry, but I don't want to bother her. I instead decided I was going to confront Mrs. Anthony when I get to school tomorrow about this strange homework tax. The next day, I took Timothy to school like I normally do, but this time I walked out with him and walked into his class. I saw Mrs. Anthony alone in the classroom, and she greeted me with a smile. "Hey, how are you?" she said as I entered the classroom. "How is Timothy behaving at home?" she continued. I responded that Timothy was doing well too, but I had some concerns about the homework you said yesterday. The one about how much would they miss their parents. I'm concerned because it's a very strange and confusing question to ask a group of 9 to 10 years kids. I also noticed that Timothy wrote that he might have to love someone else if he had to, like you told him. I would like you to explain that, I ended. Oh, that, she replied as she let out a smile. Yesterday I was teaching them about how parents love and protect their kids, and also there will also be other people to help them if they needed help, she responded. I wasn't satisfied with the answer and was about to question her further when suddenly a large group of students entered the classroom. They were all walking in two rows. They greeted Miss Anthony and greeted her one by one. They seemed very well behaved, almost too well behaved. I then saw Timothy take a seat next to a student with his arms crossed. As he entered with the rest of the class, Timothy's behavior changed. He sat in his seat and was staring at a particular spot with his eyes wide open. I looked around and noticed that all the children were staring at that same spot without blinking. I called Timothy, but he just looked at me like he had seen a ghost, then immediately looked back at that same spot that the whole class was staring at. What could they be staring at? I looked at Mrs. Antonia and saw that she was smiling widely at me. Something was wrong in this classroom. They were not blinking. I became worried, but I couldn't stop watching them. Mrs. Antonia was smiling at me, and I knew for sure that something wasn't right. I mean, even my son could not recognize me. I asked Mrs. Antonia what it was all about, and she said it was part of a morning routine for the class to stare at her for some seconds before the lectures began. But I was sure they weren't staring at her, but something else that I couldn't see. And did she say some seconds? That was close to 2 minutes. Something didn't feel right, but I knew that Timothy needs to stay in school as this was part of their morning routine that they had. I left still with concerns about the homework, but I decided to wait and see if any other strange homework would be set before I would take further matters. I decided I would pick Timothy from school, so I left work a little bit early and drove over to the school. The school bell rang, and some of all the students were dismissed and starting to come out of the school gate. Most of the students came out running and screaming with excitement out of the school gate, except for the students in Mrs. Antonia's class. All walked out in line, walking slowly. This disturbed me. I have never seen a group of students so well behaved, especially even after the school bell had rang. Timothy walked out to the car and hopped in. He didn't say anything and sat in his seat, staring straight forward. I asked him if he was okay, and he just replied with the word yes. I drove him home in silence, and when we got home, Timothy walked straight to his room and shut the door. I knew something was definitely wrong, but I don't know what it was since he wouldn't tell me. I decided to leave him alone until my wife got home, then I would tell her everything that has been going on. She got home about half an hour later, and I sat her down and explained everything that has been going on. She sat and listened and started to look more and more worried with every word that I said. Maybe I should go and talk to him. He might like that, she said once I finished explaining everything to her. I agreed, so she went into his room and I waited in the sitting room for them to finish talking. 15 minutes later, Timothy walked out of his room to where I was. He was holding a small book and he said, "Can you help me with my homework, Daddy?" "Of course, come and show me what you need help with," I replied. He held out his notebook and I took it out of his hand and read through the homework. Written on the notebook, which was one task, which said, "Research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetics." I barely finished reading the sentence when I felt a sharp pain on my neck. I looked down and saw the needle sticking out of the neck. Timothy was holding the other end of the needle with a blank stare on his face. Everything started to go blank, and the last thing I remembered was seeing Timothy staring down at me. I laid unconscious on the floor. I don't know how long I was out, but I was awoken by my wife screaming and crying. I woke up, surprised as she continued to scream. "He's gone, no, Timothy is gone," she kept screaming. I looked up at her, and the first thing I saw was a small needle print at the side of her neck. She had been injected too. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to find my son. I tried my best to get up, but I guess the anesthetic hadn't properly worn off yet, but I couldn't move properly. I could move my arms, so I managed to get my phone out of my pocket and dial the police. I explained to them what had happened, and they said that they would send some officers out to begin looking for Timothy. I then noticed that it was already 9 a.m. in the morning, so I decided to call the school to see if Timothy had gone there. I dialed and a lady answered the phone. I asked if she had seen Timothy from Mrs. Antonia's class. "No, I'm very sorry, but we haven't seen him today. In fact, we haven't seen anyone from Mrs. Antonia's class today, and they are all absent, which is very wild because Mrs. Antonia hasn't shown up for work either today," the lady said on the phone. I hung up and sat in silence for a moment. My wife had heard what the lady said, so she just sat there in silence crying. All this happened 3 weeks ago, and Timothy is still missing, along with Mrs. Antonia and the rest of his classmates. All of the parents of the kids in Mrs. Antonia's class have the same story. They were injected with something by their own children, and when they woke up, their child was gone. No one knew where they went, but we all have the same question: where? The police launched a massive search operation, scouring the towns, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing evidences, but everything seemed to lead in a dead end, and the mystery is only deepening. The parents were frantic, posting flyers and pleading for information on social media. The community was in shock, struggling to comprehend the force of what happened. Days turned into weeks, and the silence was deafening. Then one evening, a cryptic message appears on the school website: "Look for us where the mind is free." The police were baffled, but one parent, a psychologist named Dr. Maria, had an idea. She remembered a secluded retreat center on the outskirts of the town, known for its unconventional teaching method and rumored connection to a cult-like organization. She convinced the police to investigate. What they found was chilling. The retreat center was transformed into a makeshift school with Mrs. Antonia as their leader. The children were being brainwashed, conditioned to obey only her commands. They were forced to participate in several rituals, and their mind was filled with twisted ideologies. The police rescued the children, but Mrs. Antonia was nowhere to be found. As the children returned home, They were met with tears of joy and relief, but the journey to the recovery was long. Mrs. Anthony was arrested and charged with kidnapping, brainwashing, and child endangerment. The trial went on. The social media and the community demanded justice for the traumatized kids. As the trial unfolded, disturbing details emerged about Mrs. Antonia's past. She has been a devoted member of the court, rising through the ranks to become a leader. She has recruited vulnerable individuals, including children, and manipulated them to do her bidding. The prosecution presented evidence of brainwashing techniques she used, including hypnosis and manipulation tactics. The children testified about their experiences, recounting several rituals and twisted ideologies they were forced to endure. The defense argued that Mrs. Antonia was a victim of the court herself, brainwashed into carrying out their sinister plans, but the prosecution countered that she was a willing participant, using her charisma and intelligence to manipulate the others. In the end, the jury delivered a guilty verdict and Mrs. Antonia was sentenced to life imprisonment. The community breathed a fresh, correct